Coming up on this week's edition of Sunday Nation, the Catholic Church, slavery and racial justice. Why did the Catholic Church in Michigan spend millions of dollars in unsuccessfully trying to defeat Proposal 3, the right to abortion? Will they spend that kind of money and devote that kind of energy in fighting for racial justice? Well, we're talking to a black Catholic, the outspoken attorney Tina Patterson of the Patterson Justice Council. She's talking to us about what she thinks the Catholic Church ought to do under Pope Francis. And then my exclusive interview with Judge Terry Lynn Dennings, the only African-American judge in the Macomb County Circuit Court. She was just elected. History being made in Macomb County. And of course, then the city of Farmington Hills, the Reverend Dr. Coleman Patricia Barnes, and the senior pastor of the First African Methodist Episcopal Church of Farmington Hills, and Daniel Ware, the president of Community Equity Group, are also talking to us about police reform in the city of Farmington Hills and what Reverend Barnes and Daniel Ware thinks needs to be done for black Farmington Hills here in Michigan. And of course, my conversation with the veteran pollster Ed Sapolis, who is the president of Target Insight, about the missteps of the Democratic Party and Detroit in the wake of the midterm elections. All coming up on this week's edition of Sunday Nation. Don't go anywhere. Church in Michigan spent millions of dollars to defeat Proposal 3, and yet they were very unsuccessful. But will they spend millions of dollars to fight for racial justice and equity, especially in the national era for Black Lives Matter? Here to talk about it is the outspoken attorney and the principal attorney at the Patterson Justice Council, attorney Tina Patterson. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You wrote a column recently in the Pulse Institute where you talked about the question of slavery, racial justice, and black Catholics. As an African-American member of the Catholic Church, you have some issues in terms of what you believe the Catholic Church is not doing.
Yes, absolutely. Particularly when you look at the past election cycle, we all know that when it comes to the issue of abortion, we know very well what the position of the Catholic Church is. They make it very well known that they are against any type of abortion and that they are very much for the right to life, the sanctity of life, which is fine and well. The problem is that they don't exert nearly as much effort into life issues once we are here on earth and living this life. They don't really talk about the socioeconomic problems that we have in cities like Detroit, particularly with racism against African Americans. And the reason it is so contrasting with the Catholic Church is because of their own history and legacy with chattel slavery of African Americans, with racism within the church generally.
And I want to get into that, but I want to start though with you as a black Catholic feeling the need to speak about this. Sure. We don't find too many black Catholics who are speaking about what they feel the Catholic Church ought to be doing in this era and in this moment.
That's true, and I believe it's because many of them don't see that voice out there to say the things that we all know is happening. And I think another issue is that many black Catholics are embedded within the church, and so the church's official position is not as outspoken. And so for them it would be almost a conflict with the church itself, which I don't believe it is.
Do you feel that they're more prone to adopting the church's own official position?
Not even their official position, but maybe even their unofficial position, the things that they've seen the church do, the things that they've seen the church not do, the quiet, the silence of the church, and thinking that maybe I shouldn't say anything.
Right.
So I think that they get comfortable with that, even though they know and they can see and experience that there are problems.
The church here in Michigan, the Catholic Church in Michigan, was very, very active in the passing of Proposal 3. The Archbishop of Detroit, Allen Vinegron, was out there. We've not seen them out there on the question of police brutality, on the on the issues, racial justice issues that do affect black members of the Catholic Church.
Oh, absolutely. It was very shocking to me as a Catholic myself, and receiving the emails and notifications, receiving an email from the Archbishop himself. That never happens. But when it came to this particular election cycle and this issue of abortion, they were out in full force. You know, an email from the Archbishop about an issue such as this, when we have the killing of George Floyd, when we have regular occurrences of racism and police brutality every single day, there's no Archbishop email on those issues every single day. Every week, every month, once a year, we don't see it. But when it came to this issue, it had to be known that this is what we can't stand for. Well, if we're going to bring life into this world and cherish it, which we should do, that also goes into cherishing each and every member of society and having their basic rights and dignities respected. And we don't see that with African Americans in particular.
And the choice of language is very important. I've noticed that in the wake of the passage of Proposal 3, the Archbishop invoked a word that has so much strong historical and cultural resonance for black people. He invoked the word reparation.
Yes.
And the church, the Catholic Church, has something to do with this. The Jesuits, you know, thrived off black enslavement in the South.
Not just thrive, they were rescued from it.
Right.
Georgetown
Go ahead.
University, yes, the oldest Catholic university in the nation, was on the brink of bankruptcy, but it was saved through the sale of enslaved black men, women, and children by the Jesuit order. And this was just in Georgetown, in Washington, D.C. There are many instances across the country where slaves were sold, or the Catholic Church otherwise profited, particularly the Jesuit order, profited from the slave trade and chattel slavery when it came to just their missions around the country. So the use of reparations was almost insulting, you can say, because there's
if I were advising the Archbishop Allen Vinegron of Detroit, I would not have advised him to use the word reparations in responding to abortion, because that's a word that has historically, culturally been used to address the question of slavery.
Not even historically, but it's still in question today.
Yeah.
We can take, for instance, the late Congressman John Conyers of Detroit and how he pushed the bill to study reparations for 30 years. And only after his passing,
H.R. 40.
Correct. Only after his passing did it become more popular. After the execution of George Floyd, did that actually become a viable issue to actually study and implement, perhaps? And we see it across the country in states like Rhode Island and others, where the issue is on the table for policymakers to actually consider and to implement. So we know what reparations is. Is that the only use of reparations? No. But when it comes to African American issues, when it comes to social justice issues, there's a very clear definition of what reparations is. So for the Catholic Church to use it in another context, when we're talking about abortion, was very much out of place, particularly when they don't use that kind of language and that kind of urgency to combat racism.
We have to talk about Pope Francis, and in fact, here is Pope Francis speaking in Congress when he visited the United States, invoking the name of our premier civil rights leader, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.
Here too, I think of the march which Martin Luther King led from Selma to Montgomery 50 years ago as part of the campaign to fulfill his dream of full civil and political rights for African Americans. That dream continues to inspire us all, and I am happy that America continues to be, for many, a land of dreams. Dreams which lead to action, to participation, to commitment. Dreams which awaken what is deepest and truest in the life of the people.
Pope Francis talk about Pope Francis, because he's been very out front, perhaps more than any pontiff in modern times, on the issues of equity. He was in Canada, you know, apologizing to the indigents and so forth. Do you think there's an opportunity here for the Catholic Church under Pope Francis to do right on racial justice, profiting from black enslavement with the Jesuits and so forth?
I believe so. I think the mistake would be for it to begin and end with Pope Francis. I think that he is definitely opening up the path towards that. I mean, the Catholic Church is a centuries-old institution, and we're just seeing for the first time the issues that he's pushing. Excuse me, how he's elevating women into the Catholic Church, how he's elevating people from...
Yeah, the dicastery, I've seen that,
exactly,
yeah.
and people from Asia, Latin America, Africa, in ways that were not seen before him. So is it going to be all accomplished with him? No, but can it start with him? Absolutely. And my hope is that there is finally an opening that he is put into place into the institution to make these issues more viable for the institution to combat, to make them more come to life for other communities around the world, because we're talking about the Catholic Church and its large influence. It has influence in places like Africa, right, where black people are, places in the Caribbean, even places in Europe where the black diaspora is. And so there has to be pockets of hope around the world for the Catholic Church to insert that seed that we're actually going to be finally addressing all the issues that we've had in the wrong and we've done wrong in the past, with all the issues of racism and slavery, what we profited from, and not just kind of the lip service that we've been seeing. But
Yeah.
I think that Pope Francis, his words, his apology in Canada, I think it has begun to open the path toward that. I think the mistake would be to say it all has to be done now.
You know, as you're speaking, the lip service aspect of it, I want to talk about just for those African members, those black people who are members of the Catholic Church, because we do have a lot of them. I mean, they're hardly recognized as well. How significant is it for them not to see what you're saying as just some sort of an isolated issue, but something that really affects their very own existence?
Well, I think that it's important because many of them know, I mean, just from a daily life experience, that this is an issue, but don't see the path toward resolving that issue or think it can be resolved, particularly
Right.
through the church, just because of its history. But for me, obviously being a person of faith and believing something better and greater than what we see, it's always possible. So my hope is that with Pope Francis's leadership, with his guidance, and with the seeds he's planting, with the way he's changing the church little by little, that it will reap a larger harvest in the future. So what we see today are just the beginnings of what can be much, much better. And I think that the more that we see this, the more people will be encouraged to speak out more, and not to condemn anything, but just to say, listen, this has been an issue for a very long time. This is an issue that has had no resolution, but we do see a path forward to one, and we can be the change that we wish to see in bringing that change about, you know, with obviously the leadership of Francis, and with just our own voices and what we see and bringing our faith to the world.
You know, when you talk to, I mean, even when you look at the church itself, you know, they normally have committees on African American issues,
Right.
committees on African affairs, on Asian American issues, and so forth. But it becomes just one more committee, right?
Yes.
And it doesn't really advance anything. What would you advise the Catholic Church in America, by extension, specifically the Catholic Church in Michigan? We've seen how they went to war on Proposal 3.
Right.
What would you advise them to do right now? The Catholic Church in Michigan, and of course also the black Catholic organizations that are here in Michigan. What would you advise them to do right now as it relates to racial equity, racial justice, and coming from the century legacy of slavery as it relates to the Jesuits, who admitted what they did?
Well, the Jesuits have, I think, an established order to do something. They need to follow through on it. They made a $100 million pledge, and only as of August, 180,000 has been committed. So
Yeah, I saw that in the New York Times.
Yes.
Shameful commitment, though.
Well, absolutely. Well, so the Jesuits have somewhere to start. For black Catholics and the organizations that are around, I think becoming more vocal, understanding that your voice is not a weapon of war, per se. It is not a harmful tool. It can be a helpful tool, particularly when we see inequities such as racism in the world. And when it comes to the Catholic Church generally, particularly here in Michigan, though, I think we need to see not just lip service, like you mentioned, and we need to see actual not committees, we need to see policy-making organizations that are funded well in order to combat these issues. I give an example in a piece I wrote that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has an ad hoc committee on racism. Ad hoc is temporary in nature. A committee you can dissolve at any time. And then you have the Michigan Catholic Conference here, which is the policy arm that was able to fight Proposal 3 so well. But it's its own established arm of the church. The church needs to do that with racism, with fighting against social injustices, have its own policymaking arm to do that, and it can very well do that and be well funded and make some significant changes. And lastly, to put authentic voices in there. It's not enough to just say, look what we have, and that's enough, and you dress it up, make it look really nice, but if there's no substance there. It has to be something substantive, it has to be something meaningful, it has to be something with some very serious intent, because that's the only way we're ever going to really address these problems.
Because sometimes there's the attraction to set up something and put voices in there who actually will just do the opposite and not really authentic, and they're not trying to drive change, but they're just black faces in high places.
Oh, absolutely. We see enough of that in our own government. We don't need to see that in the Catholic Church any longer. We see that in many, what we call status quo institutions or traditional institutions, higher education, law. But that does not have to be the way. That is not the only way. I think that what we need to do is become a lot more creative in how we operate and how we do things and how we accomplish things. Be a lot more creative about it. Have a lot more intention about what we're doing, because if not, all the effort is wasted. I mean, there's so much resources that go into that, the money, the people, for nothing, just to keep repeating these same cycles and we still have these same issues. So we need to take that same energy, that same resourcefulness, and put it into a vehicle that's actually going to drive change.
Two quick questions before we go. How important was it for Pope Francis to invoke Martin Luther King Jr. in his address to Congress, which we just showed?
Oh, absolutely very important, because Martin Luther King was not a Catholic, right? But he was perhaps one of the best known religious leaders, spiritual leaders in the entire world, and will be for centuries to come. And Pope Francis is one of a long line of popes, the leaders of the Catholic Church. So for him to defer to Martin Luther King and honor him the way that he did and bring it to Congress and talking to our political body about the importance of this man who was not a politician, who was not a Catholic, but who was a black man who understood the importance of combating against the evil of racism and not putting anyone down with it, using his faith to lift people up. I think that was very significant. In
a few quick seconds here on the Catholic Church in Detroit and driving issues of equity, would you like to see more of that? Oh,
absolutely more. There are so many issues that we have here in Detroit. We've had, we still deal with segregation and racism, even though it's a majority black city. We still deal with police brutality. We deal with a $600 million overtaxation of homeowners, which the Catholic Church has been silent about. It's not enough to just say you minister to the poor and the downtrodden. You have to actually put the faith, the works behind the faith. You have to do the action, and the Catholic Church has a lot of it to do. Right here in the city of Detroit, it can start.
All right, thank you so much for being here. The outspoken attorney Tina Patterson, principal attorney at the Patterson Justice Council, and a member of the Catholic Church, laying it out in terms of the challenges of the Catholic Church in this era and the need for the Catholic Church to fight racial justice, fight racial injustice, and take on the issues of inequality in the black community with the same measure, vigor that it took in trying to defeat Proposal 3. We'll be right back with more on Sunday Nation. I'm Bankole Thompson. Stay with us.